The final two objections that we're going to consider, objection number 3 and objection number 4, I think are going to be a little bit more down to earth, a little bit more straightforward and easier to understand. Objection number 3 is going to fall under the title or the heading, Critical and Experiential Interests, Problems with the Model Itself. And the fourth one is going to fall under the title, The State's Interest in Margot's Life. So let's go ahead and consider objection number 3. So with regard to this objection, we might ask whether or not it's the case that people, generally speaking, even ever do set a precedent. Do they ever even get around to writing advance directives or a will of one form or another? What Dresser says is that most people don't. And so, since according to Dresser at least, most people don't set a precedent, the evidence suggests that, it's just, generally speaking, most of the time people never get around to writing an advance directive. Well, then we might ask, what if Margot hadn't written an advance directive? Or maybe what if Margot's precedent wasn't sufficiently clear? What should we do in that sort of case? Right? So what if the family members are arguing over what exactly is meant by a precedent that was set? What if there's a dispute about what is the right way to interpret what Margot said, such that it's not clear that a precedent was ever really even set in the first place? What Dresser says is that Dworkin basically just omits this sort of situation altogether. Dworkin's just working off of the assumption that people do set a precedent. But when we're trying to understand what we mean by autonomy, we can't simply mean by autonomy that autonomy only applies when people set a precedent. I mean, most of the time people don't set the kind of advance directive. They don't have that in writing or anything. They haven't really sufficiently made clear what their precedent would have been. So does that mean that they just don't have a right to autonomy? That doesn't seem right. The other thing that Dresser points out is that most people live from day to day. They live from experience to experience. While they might have some kind of interest in their life narrative, their life story, that might only be insofar as they get pleasure out of the current experience they have in living towards or trying to create their own life narrative. Right? So again, this point is pretty straightforward. Dresser thinks that the empirical evidence suggests that most people, when you go and you ask people, most of the times they're living kind of day to day. They're living with their experiential interests in mind, not their critical interests. And again, Dresser points out that Dworkin does not appeal to any kind of empirical evidence in support of the claim that people do live with their critical interests in mind. He never supplies the kind of empirical evidence you might expect to substantiate the claim that when people are making choices, their autonomous choices are based upon creating this life narrative. And this is kind of intuitive. Right, when you get up in the morning, you make some breakfast, you take a shower, you get yourself dressed and ready to go to work or go to class. When you do this, are you doing it with the sort of creating your life narrative in mind? I mean, I suppose some people do that, but do they do it all the time? I mean, I for one, when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I need is coffee. I need to drink some coffee so that way I'm not a complete grouch first thing in the morning. And I'm not doing that as a way of kind of contributing to my life story or because I've got my critical interest in mind. I'm doing it because of my current, present experience. And insofar as I have these critical interests in mind, insofar as I'm even thinking about my life narrative or contributing to and taking responsibility for the unfolding of my life story, well, the only reason why I'm doing that is presumably might be because of the current and present experience I get from doing that. So this is just a general way in which Dresser's trying to demonstrate that there are some interesting inconsistencies involved with the way in which Dworkin has presented his precedent view of autonomy, right? Because if Dworkin's theory of autonomy is inconsistent with the empirical evidence of the way we actually live our lives, then that seems to suggest that it's a really good grounds to reject that view of autonomy as being the best view of autonomy, the best analysis of autonomy we have available. And then the last thing that we should maybe point out, this gets back to the first thing that we were talking about, is where do we draw the line between one's experiential interests and one's critical interests? Right? So notice that Dresser is not denying that we have critical interests in addition to one's experiential interests. What Dresser seems to be doing is just kind of appealing to the empirical evidence. And the empirical evidence seems to suggest there's no clear way to draw a boundary line or a sharp distinction between one's critical interest and one's experiential interest. Instead, the empirical evidence seems to suggest that these things, these different kinds of interests, are very much intertwined with each other. You can't just pull them apart the way in which Dworkin seems to suggest we need to in order to argue for the precedent view of autonomy. And so that seems, again, that's supposed to show that we have good reason to reject Dworkin's view of precedent autonomy as being the best way to give an analysis of autonomy, the best way to think about what is it that we mean by autonomy. So now let's consider the fourth and final objection Dresser raises to Dworkin's theory of autonomy.